But okay, we're doing chapter 5.
Yeah.
Srila Prabhupada Lilamrta. Hare Krishna, everybody. This week we're starting a new chapter.
It's called The War.
The War. Ominously titled chapter, The War. So we'll start with Mangalacharanam prayers like usual, and then we'll get into it. Om Jnana Timirandasya Gyananjana Salakaya Chakshurun Militam Vena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Sri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatanditam Sajivam Sadvetam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Visakanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrindavan Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhayevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, Hare Krishna. Chapter 5, The War. Under the circumstances, since 1936 up to now, I was simply speculating whether I shall venture this difficult task, and that without any means and capacity. But as none have discouraged me, I have now taken courage to take up the work. Srila Prabhupada from Back to Godhead magazine. The fire in the mat broke out almost immediately. A senior disciple said that there should be one acharya who would be the spiritual successor to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati and who would perform all initiations and settle all controversies. But Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had never said that. He had never called for one acharya. Rather, he had instructed the members of the Gaudiya Math to form a governing body of 12 men to carry on a concerted effort. But that instruction was abandoned, and the suggestion that there be one leader took hold. A single person instead of 12 should take charge, and now it became a rush for who. Two parties contested. Ananta Vasudev, one of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's leading preachers, was ambitious, and he pressed his claim with a group of influential sannyasi supporters. Another man, Kunjavahari, shrewdly went after the properties. He had been a leading administrator under Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, and now he claimed ownership of the palatial temple in Calcutta, as well as all the other properties and assets of the India-wide Gaudiya Math. Although in his will, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had expressed his desire that his disciples select a governing board to manage all properties and funds of the Gaudiya Math, Kunjavahari contested the will's legitimacy. He and his supporters argued that since Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had received the properties on behalf of God, he was not their rightful owner, and therefore could not determine their future ownership. Thus, he and the others disputed over the legal and theological aspects of the former acharya's position. Shortly after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's passing away, litigation had begun. Ananta Vasudeva, supported by a majority of the members of the Gaudiya Math, had claimed that he, as the next Acharya, was the owner and director of the properties. But although Kunja Bihari had only a few supporters, he defied the majority by pressing his claim through lawyers in court. Kunja Bihari and his men had possession of the Caitanya Math and the temples in Mayapur. Vasudev's party captured other buildings. Quarreling and fistfights broke out. The preaching of the Gaudiya Math stopped. Abhai's inability to take part in the activities of the Gaudiya Math was suddenly in his favor. He had always been more a visitor than a member at the Math, and, at least externally, more the Grihastha businessman than a missionary worker. This automatically put him at a distance from the fray. Of course, he was associated with the Maths in Bombay and Allahabad, but he had no managerial position, no claims to ownership, and no role in the litigation. Nor did he desire to take sides in the struggle for power. Like many of the other disciples, he was mortified to see that his spiritual master's instructions for cooperation had been disregarded and his mission thrown into a legal dispute. Abhay knew that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had wanted the leaders to work cooperatively, and so he could not sympathize with the warring factions. Both parties were an insult to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, but he wanted to preach. Although becoming a very good English preacher was something he was meditating on more than actively doing, the Gaudiya Math would logically have been the vehicle for his preaching. He had already contributed articles to the Gaudiya Math publications and had been working with his godbrothers at the Allahabad and Bombay centers. Naturally, he thought of serving his spiritual master in terms of serving within his spiritual master's mission. But the Gaudiya Math, which had always been known for pure, bold preaching of the message of Lord Caitanya, was now becoming known for embroiled factions. As the Gaudiya Math broke down, he was also affected. Under the present circumstances, how could he carry out his spiritual master's order to preach? Previously, the main obstacle to his preaching had been family commitments, but now the obstacles were compounded. Now he had to wait helplessly for the outcome of this struggle. What would Krishna bring about? 1938. His Bombay business diminishing, Abhay, now 42, moved back to Calcutta with his wife and family and rented a house at 6 Sitakanta Banerjee Lane. The street was but a narrow lane lined on either side with 3-story houses. His office was on the first floor facing the street, and the family lived upstairs. He rented the adjoining building, number 7, and on the first floor opened a small chemical laboratory manufacturing distilled water, Day's pain liniment, Vimal tonic, Alpa, an injection for boils, and various other medicines. He also utilized a small outbuilding in the rear as part of his lab. Out front, he hung a large signboard, Abhay Charan Day and Sons, displaying a picture of a mustached Abhay Charan. Sometimes he would employ 2 or 3 servants to assist him, but mostly he worked alone, and he would deliver his last jugs of distilled water to agents such as Bengal Company and Gluconet. He printed a brochure advertising Day's pain liniment, good for relieving gout, rheumatism, and all pains. And if one wanted to be free of recurring diseases like rheumatism and gout, Abhay's brochure directed that in addition to using Day's pain liniment, one refrain from alcohol and all sorts of drinking or intoxicating habits, and food and drink should be very simple and innocent, such as vegetables and milk. The new Calcutta business enjoyed an early success, but Abhay didn't have his heart in it. It was a duty. He had to do it to maintain his family. His new acquaintances in Calcutta found him to be a devotee of God at heart, a businessman, a family man, but more concerned with writing and preaching than with business and family. Chandi Mukherjee, a neighbor from nearby Bihari Street. He was interested only in devotional activities, and he did his business only to maintain the family. He didn't seem interested in the profit motive, in accumulating money, or becoming a rich man. Charan Mukherjee, Abhay's next-door neighbor. Abhay Charan Dey was always a very patient listener to every illogical argument that anybody, including myself, would bring to him. Not knowing philosophy, I would illogically present so many arguments, and Mr. Day would always very patiently listen. Nothing agitated him. He was always very calm, and he taught me about God. He would speak only of Krishna. He was translating the Gita and was maintaining his business. Neighbors would often see him sitting on his cot in the front room. He would read his spiritual master's books and sometimes recite the Sanskrit slokas out loud. He liked to discuss philosophy with anyone who came by. His family, keeping mostly upstairs, Abhay would sit alone in the downstairs front room, dressed in a dhoti and kurta, or sometimes a dhoti and only a vest. Often he would be at his writing, while outside the door his children played with the children of the Ganguly family, who lived in the rear apartment of the same building. The neighbors lived openly in a kind of joint neighborhood family, and Abhay talked freely with the other neighbors, but of Vaishnava philosophy and only rarely of business. Mr. Ganguly found Abhay's speech scholastic and always very philosophical. Abhay was absorbed in the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, and even in brief conversations he would refer to Lord Krishna and to Bhagavad Gita's description of Lord Krishna as the basis of both the material and spiritual worlds. While working in his laboratory, or receiving a delivery of empty bottles from the Muslim bottle merchant, or going out to sell his medicine, he would be talking or thinking about God. In those days, for a person in Calcutta to be interested in God consciousness was not so unusual. Abhay found even a man like Abdullah, the Muslim bottle merchant, to be very religious. One day, Abhay asked Abdullah, who had once been very poor, but had become rich by his business, "Now you've got money, so how are you going to use your money?" The bottle merchant replied, "My dear sir, I have an intention to construct a mosque."
Meanwhile, the war of the Gaudiya Mat raged on. Both factions were ill-motivated, and both deviated from the instructions of their spiritual master. The very act of trying to determine ownership of the properties through legal action meant that the God brothers were disobeying the express desire of their spiritual master as stated in his will. The litigation continued year after year, but the legal wrangling could not bring them together or purify them. One court ruled in favor of Ananta Vasudev, but then a higher court awarded 2/3 of the Mat's property to Kunja Vihari and 1/3 to Vasudev. Still, although Vasudev had fewer properties, he inspired more followers. He seemed to them more intent on reviving the preaching of the Gaudiya Mat. But when Vasudev subsequently fell down from the principles of sannyas by going off with a woman, the groups broke further to pieces. Most of the sannyasis continued to maintain their principles, but many now left the jurisdiction of the two contending factions in disgust. Individuals formed their own ashrams, Gaudiya Mission, Caitanya Gaudiya Mat, and others. The unified entity of Gaudiya Mat as an all-India mission consisting of many temples, several presses, and hundreds of devotees working cooperatively under one leadership ceased to exist. God brothers continued to uphold the teachings of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as they had received them from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, but because they were meant to work together, they lacked their former united potency. Illusions of proprietorship and prestige had superseded the spiritual master's order, and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's cause, a worldwide movement for propagating Lord Chaitanya's teachings, collapsed. Wherever Abhay went, he seemed to attract the company of his god brothers. Some followers of Sridhar Maharaj, the same Sridhar with whom he had worked in Bombay and whom he had always regarded as a good devotee and scholar, met Abhay at his place on Banerjee Lane and told this news to Sridhar Maharaj, who was then living at his own ashram in Mayapur. Sridhar Maharaj had disaffiliated himself from the factions of the Gaudiya Mat, but as a sannyasi, he was still preaching and was interested in publishing Vaishnava literature. He had wanted to maintain an ashram in Calcutta, so for 20 rupees a month, he rented from Abai the 4 rooms on the 2nd floor of number 7, above Abai's chemical laboratory. Now, whenever they came to Calcutta, Sridhar Maharaj, Puri Maharaj, and Bhakti Saranga Maharaj based themselves there, staying in small separate rooms. It became a regular ashram for sannyasis and brahmacharis, and Sridhar Maharaj put a sign out front, Devananda Saraswati Mat. Sridhar Maharaj's establishment of a mat in Mayapur with a branch in Calcutta was his response to the Gaudiya mat split. Like other sannyasis, he had been initiating disciples and preaching, not waiting for the outcome of the litigation with its continued appeals and counterclaims. Abai was glad to encourage Sridhar Maharaj and the others who joined him at his little ashram. Here Abai and Sridhar Maharaj and his followers could remain aloof from the warring factions and together pursue their plans for spreading Krishna consciousness. The sannyasis cooked in their separate kitchen, performed their puja, and held morning and evening kirtans and lectures. Abai remained with his family, taking his own meals and performing his own puja, but he often went to discuss Srimad Bhagavatam with Sridhar Maharaj. From his roof, Abai could see the towering steeple of his spiritual master's building, the Gaudiya Mat of Bag Bazaar, its ownership now contested by bitter factions. Abai would often accompany Sridhar Maharaj and his assistants at preaching programs where he would play the mridanga. And when Sridhar Maharaj fell ill, Abai led the other devotees on preaching engagements, performing kirtan, playing mridanga, and giving lectures on the Bhagavatam. Sridhar Maharaj: we did not see Abai as working very hard for making money, nor did he seem very rich or to have a lot of liquid funds. He was attracted more to the spiritual side of affairs than to his family affairs. He never discussed business prospects with me, whether the business was up or down, or whether he was planning to do this or that. Monetarily, he did not have sufficient funds for giving any to the mission.
Right. Abhay began to think seriously about writing Vaishnava literature. His spiritual master had seemed very pleased and had told the editor of The Harmonist, whatever he writes, publish it. Business profits, if he could somehow expand them, could go for printing books in English, as his spiritual master had said. If you ever get money, print books. Certainly the Gaudiya Mat was not going to do it. Kunja Bihari had sold Bhaktisiddhanta's printing presses to offset his legal expenses. No, Abai would have to continue on his own, maintaining his business and simultaneously trying to write and publish. And that was also the prescription of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. It is better that he is living outside your company. When the time comes, he will do everything himself. It was in 1939 that Abai wrote Introduction to Gita Upanishad. It was a short piece, but it signalled his intention to take on the task of one day translating Bhagavad Gita into English with commentary. Of course, there were already many commentaries in English, but most of them had been written by impersonalists or others who had not delivered the original spirit of the Gita, the spirit of Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, hearing Bhagavad Gita directly from Lord Krishna. Abai knew, however, that he could present Bhagavad Gita in the proper spirit by writing an English commentary based on the teachings of Lord Caitanya and the disciplic succession. So he began. Whenever he could make time, he would write. Although a strict grammarian could find fault in his English composition, his meaning was always clear. In his introduction, Abai reflected on the time when, as a young schoolboy, he had attended a lecture, Vidya Ratna, the jewel of education. The theme of the lecture had been that God does not exist and could not exist. If there were God, he would certainly have appeared on earth to put an end to all religious rivalry. But since God had not obliged man in this way, we should banish all thought of his existence from our minds. The audience, Abai explained, consisting only of so many young boys, did not delve deeply into the subject matter of the lecture, yet the majority, impressed by the arguments, carried away lofty ideas of godlessness and thus became agnostics at home. Abai had not been satisfied with the agnostic conclusion, because I had been trained by my father to be engaged in the worship of Sri Sri Radha Govinda. But as a result of the Vijayratna lecture, I was experiencing some mental conflict between agnosticism and the existence of Godhead. Later, having heard from his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, Abai understood that the personality of Godhead exists in every sphere of activity, but we do not have the eyes to see him, Abai wrote. Even if the Lord personally manifests himself on earth, the quarrelling mundaners will not stop their fighting and look upon Godhead or his representative due to ignorance. This is the birthright of the individual soul by the grace of God. Bhagavad Gita is the true jewel of education, and in the Gita, Lord Krishna declares to the fighting people on earth, "Here I am, do not quarrel." The agnostic who had spoken of the jewel of education had been blinded by the jewel, and therefore could not see and appreciate the personality of Godhead. Thus he had gone on to convince others to become so-called jewels also. Following his spiritual master, Abai displayed an aggressive spirit for confronting all opponents of pure theism. In responding to his spiritual master's order to develop into an English preacher, Abai was not simply making neutral scholarly presentations. He was willing and ready to fight, whether against modern agnostics or Vaishnavism's old traditional enemy, Mayavad impersonalism. Although few scholars taught the way of surrender to Lord Krishna, as espoused in Bhagavad Gita, almost all respected Bhagavad Gita as presenting the essence of all knowledge. The Gita, therefore, was the perfect vehicle for confronting those who misrepresented God and religion. The Gita was a challenge to the agnostics, apotheists, anthropomorphists, impersonalists, henotheists, pantheists, and absolute monists. Although there were already more than 600 commentaries on Bhagavad Gita, they had been written by persons with an inner hatred for the personality of Godhead, and therefore they were imperfect. Such envious persons, Abai wrote, have no entrance into the real meaning of Bhagavad Gita, inasmuch as a fly cannot enter into the covered jar of honey. Abai described Indian culture as an almost impassable ocean, due to its depth of thought and apparent mixtures of conclusions. But in this book, Abai declared, I will establish that Krishna is the absolute personality of Godhead by referring to the available records of scriptures, which are the recorded history of Indian culture and thought. The sannyasis at 7 Banerjee Lane were impressed by the scope of Abai's thought and intention. As it was customary to award a title to an especially worthy Vaishnava according to his qualities, Bhakti Saranga Goswami wanted to confer upon Abai the title Bhaktisiddhanta. Sridhar Maharaj, however, thought it inappropriate to give Abai the same title as their spiritual master, and he asked that Abai's title be changed to Bhaktivedanta, Bhakti meaning devotion, and Vedanta meaning the end of knowledge. Abai was grateful. The title combined the devotion of religion with the scholarship of the most rigorous philosophy, as passed down by the scholarly followers of Lord Caitanya. He appreciated the sincere gesture of his godbrothers and accepted the title as a further commitment to his spiritual path of preaching.
Sorry, I don't know that.
Sorry, it's Alexa. Abai continued regularly associating with Sridhar Maharaj and discussing with him Srimad Bhagavatam. Abai encouraged him to preach widely, although Sridhar Maharaj was admittedly more the scholar and rather shy about going out and preaching. On several occasions, Abhay tried to convince Sridhar Maharaj to go with him and charge Gandhi and Nehru as to why they weren't following the principles of Bhagavad Gita. Another fruit of the spiritual association at 7 Banerjee Lane was a book called Prapanna Jivanamrita, compiled by Sridhar Maharaj, a collection of verses from various Vaishnava scriptures, including excerpts from the works of Rupa Goswami. It was divided into 6 chapters, according to the 6 divisions of surrender. Abhay, along with the sannyasis of the Devananda Sarasvati Mat, financed the publication. Thus it was published as a joint effort by friends. Pass the baton there.
September 3rd, 1939. Lord Linlithgow, Viceroy of India, announced that India was at war with Germany. Thus England swept India into the war, without consulting any Indians. Although independence-minded India certainly resented such a show of foreign control, there were mixed feelings about the war. India wanted independence, yet she sympathized with the Allied cause against fascism in the West and feared an invasion by Imperial Japan in the East. Since you dislike the British so violently, one author asked a typical New Delhi student of the day, would you want Japan to invade and conquer India? Student, no, but we Indians pray that God may give the British enough strength to stand up under the blows they deserve. Although at the outbreak of the war, India had only 175,000 men in her armed forces, the British managed to increase the number of Indian soldiers to 2 million. There was no draft, but the British sent recruiting agents all over India, especially in the Punjab, where military service seemed an attractive offer to the local poor. The Punjabis proved good fighters, whereas Bengalis enlisted as officers, doctors, contractors, and clerks. Indian soldiers were dispatched to battlefields in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Persia, Malaya, Burma, and Assam. While the British were attempting to mobilize Indians for the war, the Indian nationalist movement, which had continued off and on for more than 20 years, became very active. Members of the Congress Party refused to cooperate with the war effort and demanded guaranteed independence for India. Some thought that since England had her hands full with Germany, the time was ripe to revolt and gain independence by force. Gandhi's position had been one of unconditional pacifism, and he opposed the idea of Indians taking up arms, even to defend India. But by 1942, he had become more inimical and had reduced his policy towards the British people to a simple, unequivocal, quit India. Thousands of Indians responded by chanting slogans in the streets and even by tearing up the railway lines. Abhay's militant former schoolmate, Subhas Chandra Bose, fought against the British in his own way. He had approached Hitler in Germany and gotten him to agree that when the Germans captured Indian soldiers, Germany would return them to Bose, who would maintain them in his nationalist army. With this army, Bose planned to return to India and drive the British from Indian soil. But dissatisfied with his progress in Germany, Bose made a similar agreement with Tojo in Japan, and soon thousands of Gurkhas and Sikhs, the best fighters in the Indian army, had defected from the British army to join Bose's freedom fighters in Singapore. Bose began to prepare his army to invade India from the north. Then, in 1943, the British found that the Japanese, who had already taken Burma, were at the doors of India, approaching Bengal. By their tactic known as the denial policy, the British sank many Indian boats carrying food and destroyed large rice crops, fearing that they would fall into the hands of the enemy. This left local Indians starving and without the boats they needed for trade. The famine that ensued was the worst that had hit Bengal in 150 years. The government removed all control of food costs, and those who could not afford to buy at the skyrocketing prices died in the streets of Calcutta. Srila Prabhupada, I have got experience The government created artificial famine. The war was going on, so Mr. Churchill's policy was to keep the people in scarcity so they will volunteer to become soldiers. So this policy was executed. Big men, they collected the rice. Rice was selling at 6 rupees per mound. All of a sudden it came to 50 rupees per mound. I was in the grocer shop purchasing, and all of a sudden the grocer said, no, I'm not going to sell any more. At that moment the price was 6 rupees per mound. So suddenly he was not going to sell. A few hours later I went back to purchase, and the rice had gone up to 50 rupees per mound. The government appointed agents began to purchase the rice and other commodities which are daily necessities. They can offer any price because the currency is in their hands. They can print so-called papers, $100, and pay. A man becomes satisfied thinking, oh, I have $100, but it is a piece of paper. That was the policy. You have no money, no rice, so another avenue is open. Yes, you become a soldier. You get so much money. People out of poverty would go there. I've seen it. No rice was available in the market, and people were hungry. They were dying. Abai managed to purchase just enough for his own family to survive, but he saw the beggar population increase by the hundreds. Month after month, he saw the footpaths and open spaces congested with beggars, cooking their food on improvised stoves and sleeping in the open or beneath the trees. He saw starving children rummaging in the dustbins for a morsel of food. And from there it was but a step to fighting with the dogs for a share of the garbage. And this also became a familiar sight in the Calcutta streets. The British had little time to spare from their war efforts, and they worked only to save those lives essential for the fight. For the common people, the Empire's prescription was uniform and simple: starvation. Srila Prabhupada. One American gentleman was present at that time. He remarked, people are starving in this way. In our country, there would have been revolution. Yes, but the people of India are so trained that in spite of artificial famine, they did not commit theft, stealing others' property. People were dying. Still they thought, all right, God has given. That was the basic principle of Vedic civilization. Abai knew that under the laws of nature there was no scarcity. By God's arrangement, the earth could produce enough food. The trouble was man's greed. There is no scarcity in the world, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had said. The only scarcity is of Krishna consciousness. And this was how Abai saw the 1943 famine. Now more than ever, this spiritual vision was relevant. Krishna consciousness was the prime necessity. How else could man be checked from his evil propensities to become greedy, hoard, make war, and thus create misery for millions? He had seen the heinous activities of the British in India. They're cutting off the thumbs of the weavers so that Indian-made cotton goods could not compete with the foreign-made cloth. They're shooting down of unarmed innocent citizens. They're creating artificial famine. They're propagating the myth that Indian civilization was primitive. Still, he did not believe that an independent Indian government would necessarily be an improvement. Unless the leadership was Krishna conscious, and neither Gandhi nor Subhas Chandra Bose was, then the government would be able to provide no real solutions, only stopgap measures. Without obedience to the laws of God, as expressed by the scriptures and sages, governments would only increase human suffering. Then Calcutta was bombed day after day. The bombing was concentrated in specific areas, such as the Kittapur port facility and Sham Bazaar in North Calcutta, very near Abai's home at Sitakanta Banerjee Lane. American planes had been leaving from airfields near Calcutta for targets in China and Japan, so the air raids on Calcutta seemed an inevitable retaliation. It was the Japanese striking back. Or was it? Some said it was the forces of Subhas Chandra Bose, since the bombs fell mostly in the European quarter. But for the people of Calcutta, it made little difference who was attacking. After the first bombing, people evacuated the city. Blackouts were imposed, and at night the entire city was dark. Srila Prabhupada. The whole Calcutta became vacant. Perhaps only myself and a few others remained. I sent my sons to Navadvip. Of course, my daughter was married. My wife refused to go out of Calcutta. She said, I'll be bombed, but I will not go. So I had to remain in Calcutta. I have seen bombing in Calcutta all night. I was just eating when there was the siren. So the arrangement was that in your house would be the shelter room. I was hungry, so I first finished eating. Then I went to the room and the bombing began. Chi, come! I was thinking that this was also Krishna in another form, but that form was not very lovable. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki Jai. Wow. Okay. I don't know if anyone has any. That's a bit of a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has any comments.
It's quite an intense
Very intense.
part of the book.
Yeah. Yeah, very intense.
With the fighting with the God brothers and then all the heavy things from the British.
Yeah. I was just thinking what Prabhupada's, when we were hearing the introduction that Prabhupada wrote to Bhagavad Gita, I was thinking, oh, that's so heavy, you know? You know, when you read it and you're like, wow, that is really heavy. And he's talking about the agnostic who had spoken of the jewel of education had been blinded by the jewel and therefore could not see and appreciate the personality of Godhead. Thus he had gone on to convince others to become so-called jewels also. I was thinking, wow, that's like, anyway, there were a few bits there.
The Ratna, something Ratna, Ratna Valley or Gita Ratna Valley or something. Yeah, I'll have to scroll back and see if I can find the book. So,
oh yeah. But I was thinking, wow, it's like really like heavy. And then when you go forward a couple of pages, or even just either side of it, and you see what was going on with his God brothers, and then you see what's going on globally, which are kind of like a microcosm and a macrocosm of the same thing, basically, you know, ego.
Boring world.
Yeah, and you read it, and you think, well, you need someone that heavy because like material energy is so heavy, you know, like so ruthless.
He didn't get, like, it would be really easy to either get tangled up in what was happening with his God brothers and to, you know, it'd be so easy to jump into that, or to see what's going on in the city around him and want to take action there, but he knew not to get tangled up and he was fixed on his mission without getting tangled up.
Yeah, he stuck to his priority in his spiritual master's order.
Yeah, very fixed. I mean, to do that in the middle of a war, it's quite full on, you know. We might have to do that before too long.
Yeah. So civil war in a few years.
Yeah, who knows? A few months, you know. Like we just got an allotment here, like this week or last, whenever it was, like a few days ago.
Yeah.
And so we're like super psyched that we've been down there getting it ready to plant vegetables in. But then the devotee shared a video on Facebook. It wasn't a devotee speaking in the video, but it was somewhere else. But this guy was saying, so I don't know, I can't say he's an authority. We should all like trust, but he was saying that even growing food on allotments isn't going to be practical because food shortages in the coming years will mean that people will just be looting and. I was like, I mean,
spades.
Yeah. He's only one voice out of many saying different things, but it's something to bear in mind, isn't it? When in the sense that it was mentioned before, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's purport to Bhagavad Gita 241, And I haven't got it now, but I used to have a recording of Tamal Krishna Maharaj reciting that purport, and I don't know what I did with it. Anyway, it's in one of his lectures, but I recorded that little bit. But it's very powerful, and he talks about he talks about fixed intelligence and sort of splayed intelligence. He says intelligence is called fixed when it's focused on carrying out the order of the spiritual master. And then he goes on and says something like, the material world may exist, or it may be completely annihilated. I do not care. He says, I simply have to carry out the order of my spiritual master. That's Vishwanath Chakravarti's Thakur's purport. He talks about fixed intelligence, and I think it's not splayed intelligence. I forget what the word is now, but
I think we discussed it on one of the other classes.
Yeah, I think it was mentioned earlier on.
Did the wrong bit of the purport, it was not exactly the right bit, but it was on about fixed intelligence and the opposite. I think we was discussing one of the Ishopanishads at the time or something.
Oh, okay, maybe it was
reference to that verse of
Yeah, and it's very powerful. He says the material world may be completely annihilated, but I don't care. I just want to carry out the order of my spiritual master.
Well,
And you think like, like the entire. I mean, it's quite inspiring because you think actually, yeah, this is really temporary, and actually the only thing you've really got is the order of your guru, because everything else is going to die. Like your wife, your husband, your kids, like everything is going to go. Obviously, we're spirit souls, but these relationships in this, in this kind of like, and these physical forms that we take now, it's all going to go. The only thing you've really got is your service to your guru, chanting around and whatever you've got to do. But so he says the entire material world can be annihilated. I don't care. I just you think, wow, that's powerful. Probably worth thinking about, because it looks like the world is being annihilated. What it is, isn't it? It's being annihilated all the time.
Kali Yuga.
Yeah. Very. I
50,000
think.
years time.
Yeah. We've got a little while yet, but I mean, the world as we know it is certainly being annihilated.
So changing.
It's changing, yeah. And I think about how easily you get distracted, like by whatever, you get a cold or your car breaks down, or whatever it is. Prabhupada sitting in the middle of World War II, just getting on with it. Yeah, it's inspiring, very inspiring, very heavy, all of this.
Yeah. That's possibly why Srila Prabhupada went through so much in his life. So kind of Krishna put him in those situations, I think, for more than one reason. His own purification and also ours, and an example and inspiration.
Yeah, it's definitely 100%. It's definitely brilliant. Sort of knowing the stories to some degree of Prabhupada's life, the way it's been written, it's obviously really accessible for people that don't know anything about Prabhupada.
Yeah.
And but also for people that do, it's nectar, right? Because you're reading things and you're already piecing together what you know about later. Like if you go back and watch a movie a couple of times, you say, oh, you see how this thing that happened at the start is actually really relevant, and it's like all the connections are there. So yeah, you can see, as well as our own for our instruction, you can see he's being prepared for something like much later on.
Even like the whole hippie movement, counterculture, it just all happened at the right time, and it's kind of like the perfect whatever sort of like seeding for Krishna consciousness to begin. And,
the ground was fertile, and definitely, 100%. Yeah. Funny, his wife won't go.
Yeah, she wants to stay.
His son,
biscuits in Calcutta.
His son went to Navadweep, the holy place, and his wife doesn't want to go, so I had to stay.
Let them bomb me.
I can see that's another sort of nail in the coffin of their marriage. Perhaps it doesn't say that explicitly, I don't think there, but
it's implied.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
sort of wonder if if you sort of read between the lines.
Well, as we're reading through, it's getting more and more clear.
Yeah,
that
it's going one way,
that-
isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
that they're
definitely.
not. The match isn't so great
Yeah.
anymore.
And I was thinking, there's a great sort of story. I don't know. I think Prabhupada tells this story as an example. He says there's like a man who's a farmer, and he has a son, and then the army come to sort of conscript his son, and then the son has just fallen off a horse and broken his back or something, and then he can't go. I can't remember what the story is.
I seem to remember something about it.
Like good things and bad, seemingly good things and seemingly bad things keep on happening.
Yeah.
And the villagers will go, "Oh, that's really good that happened to you," and he'll go, "Good, bad, who knows?"
Yeah, yeah.
And then it will turn out it was a bad thing, and then a good, and it's like nothing seems. Nothing actually is good or bad as you think it's gonna be.
He sort of falls off a horse. Oh, that was it. So he falls off a horse in one of them.
Yeah.
And then everyone goes, "Oh my goodness, your son! I'm so sorry." And he says, "Well, good, bad, I don't know." And the next day, the army come round to conscript him, and they can't take him. And
so then that actually turns out to be a good thing.
Yeah. And then you see it with Prabhupada, like he sort of wants to be part of the mat, like he wants to be in there doing stuff, but he can never quite get in.
And it turns out to be a blessing.
And then it all blows up later on, and it's actually like, well, he's kind of, independent to some degree. You can see that in Prabhupada's life. You can analyze things as things that look like, what's the word he uses? Like a reversal. When, like all these things seem to go wrong. And actually it's like coming up. It's all coming up. Yeah, it's great.
It's all Krishna's arrangement, and Krishna's arrangement is always positive, whether we can see it or not at the time, or if others can see it or not at the time.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? How so many things have happened that on the one hand look, and then you can see when you put it into the context, like we can see in our own life if you look back. Oh, I see what Krishna was doing there. Like you can't, like you said, you can't always see it at the time, but you just have to kind of have faith in it and just trust and go with it. And then later on, you can sometimes say, "Oh, I see what was happening there. That I sort of needed that or whatever." Yeah. It's great. Oh, it's getting deep. Right. Okay. So maybe we're done for this evening.
Yeah.
I've got 2 videos to upload now, so I'll do that now. And brilliant.
Happy Janmashtami for tomorrow.
Happy Janmashtami for tomorrow. And also Prabhupada's appearance day on Thursday.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if maybe we should do a special one on Thursday for Prabhupada's appearance day.
See how you are. See if you're tired from all the other celebrations.
It's a hell of a party, isn't it? It's a 2-day.
Yeah, it used to kill me when I was at the manor.
Okay,
it's quite intense.
It's a 2-day bender, isn't it? Basically, transcendental.
Lots of fasting, feasting, then fasting, and then
Yeah, definitely, and very emotional also, especially on Prabhupada's. If you're at the manor and you have all the Prabhupada disciples giving their offerings, it can be, you can be a sort of emotional wreck by the end of that. It gets really deep, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay. Well, happy Janmashtami.
Yeah.
And Srila Prabhupada ki Jai. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Take care.
Haribol.
Haribol.